Hi, this is Little Dwarf playing games while rambling incoherently into a microphone. Why? Well, just because I can, and I continue with Kingdom Come Deliverance, Blind. Now, this is going to be another episode in which I do nothing but read the Codex. So, if you're not interested in that, you can just skip it. I'll resume the normal gameplay from the next one. I read through most of the general tab last time, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read all of the rest, and then a couple of episodes from now, when the game will seem like it's ending, I'll do another reading of the entries that have been updated. So I'll skip the general tab for now and go to locations. Kutenberg. Kutenberg is today a district town of the central Bohemian region, 70 kilometers east of Prague. The founding of Kutenberg, the official name of the city in the Middle Ages, came about thanks to the discovery of silver ore deposits in the vicinity and its location next to the Sedlec Monastery, the commercial and economic center of the region. City rights were acquired by Kutenberg in 1318, after which time the economic activity of the city was taken care of by the so-called Urburer, or the royal clerk. To keep the operation of the mint and the mines to high standard and safe, a list of legal edicts was issued. Jus regale Montanorum, the mining regulative. The city soon became rich and had the same powers as the old town of Prague. The wealthiest inhabitants of Kutenberg were the German population, while a lower class consisted of mine workers, smelters, mint workers, artisans, and servants. Almost every city dweller had some connection to silver mining, minting coinage, or trading. The treasures found and mined The treasures of found and mined silver supported the development of other Czech cities, including the construction of new buildings in Prague. The architecture of Kutenberg is due to Wenceslas IV. During his reign, the former timber houses were rebuilt in brick or as half-timbered. There were also churches, a Sterling court, and other public works built at the time. Kutenberg retains its Gothic genius loci to this day. Okay, Ledeczko is a small village with a mill. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the village belonged to Arnost of Talmberg. The village originally had a second mill called Kuchelnik. Merhojed, a small village near Samopce, in which was the property of the Sasau monastery in the 15th century. The Stone Man is an unusual standing stone or stele composed of red sandstone with a carving of a warrior with a spear. It's located at the crossroads in the Sasau region between Merhojed and the field track to Talmberg. According to an unsubstantiated theory, the stele was brought here from Sasau Monastery when it was reconstructed in the 14th century. The identities of the author of the relief carving and the man depicted remain a mystery. The Stone Man may have been a Slavic warrior or Saint Longinus with the Holy Lance. His name is derived from the Greek word for lance. According to the New Testament, used it to pierce the side of Jesus on the cross. And Budin Mill. In the Middle Ages, Budin Mill was a supplier of local villages and small towns. In the 17th century, it was part of Merhojed, becoming the property of Jan Budinsky in 1678, from whom it takes its name. Okay. Abduction of... Oh, no, that's events. I didn't want to do that. Neuhof. According to written chronicles, Neuhof by Sasa was a noble's court, which was destroyed during extensive floods. The small town of Nowe Dwory was built in its place. Ratay on Sasau. Rataje was a small market town with two castles, the upper castle, known simply as the Ratay Castle, and the lower castle, known as Pirkstein or Pirkenstein. The oldest written record of Ratay dates back to the 13th century, when it was the property of Pribislav of Ratay, mentioned in the records of 1263 and 1289. At about the same time, ownership of Ratay passed to the Burgrave Horzanta of Užice, whose sons had built several other castles and villages in the surrounding area. In 1293, King Wenceslas II gave Ratay to Bishop Tobias of Bechynie. Then it became the property of the Burgrave Hynek of Dauba, who was the heir to the Lords of Lipa. Ratay experienced its greatest renown and prosperity under the administration of Henry of Lipa, who died in 1329, his sons and grandchildren. His son John, who died in 1338, was the most politically active. The town was also governed by Henry's relatives, the Lords of Pirkstein, Jeszek and Hanusz. Under their administration, the two castles were built, as were the churches, and the village was given strong fortifications. Pirkstein, the lower castle in Ratay, founded by Henry of Lipa in the mid-14th century, first mentioned dates from 1346, spreads over an island in the middle of the Żywy stream. The castle is separated from the town by a moat. This is a Bergfried-type castle with a massive tower, rounded corners in the rear, and 3 rooms on each floor. The entire structure is surrounded by ramparts. In 1447, the castle unfortunately caught fire and then quickly changed owners. It suffered even greater damage during the peasant uprising of 1627. 100 years later, from 1713 to 1724, it was rebuilt by Octavian Kinsky into a presbytery and a bell tower. Upper Castle. The upper castle was built at the same time as the lower castle in the mid-14th century. It also burned in the same year as Pirkstein, 1447. In the 16th century it was rebuilt into a Renaissance chateau, and in 1672 renovated in the Baroque style. Today it houses the local town hall. St. Matthew's Church. The lower Ratay Church was built in 1360s at the instigation of Jan Ježek Ptaček of Pirkstein and his wife Anna. The first church was probably a single nave design and served as a parish church along the Church of St. Nicholas, which no longer exists. From 1675 to 1691 it was demolished and rebuilt in the Baroque style according to the plans of André de God. It survived in this form to the present day with just few minor changes. The only remnants of the local church are the tombs of the estate owners. For example, a tombstone with the coat of arms of the Lords of Lipa mounted in the cemetery wall, and the base of the baptismal font from 1421. St. Nicholas Church, probably the older of 2 churches within the castle walls. The first mention dates back to 1343. It was located in the upper part of Ratay before the upper wall, and partially served as a presbytery. From 1336, the Korczenik Mill also belonged to the Ratay Presbytery. Rovna. The village of Rovna lies close to Srebrne Skalice, Silver Skalic. Around 1150, a Romanesque church with a presbytery and cemetery were built there by the monks from the Sasau monastery. The church was consecrated to the oldest patron of miners, St. James the Greater. The Romanesque frescoes are its most notable decorative element, painted in 2 stages, in the mid-12th century and roughly 100 years later. Samopesz is a small village in the Sasau region, not far from Ratay, first mentioned in 1397. Together with the 2 nearby mills, it belonged to the Sasau monastery until 1412 and was renowned as a center of agriculture for an ancient species of wheat, locally known as Samopesz spelt, from which the village derives its name. Sasau monastery is situated on a cliff about the many meanders of the Sasau River, or rather river, which isolates it on various sides. Its origins date back to the first half of the 11th century, when it was founded by Duke Aldrich at the instigation of the monk Procopius. Saint Procopius, canonized in 1204, became renowned particularly for wanting to preserve the old Church Slavonic religious rites in the monastery rather than adopting the Latin liturgy. According to the oldest document mentioning the construction and development, Vita Maior, the 11th century legend of Saint Procopius, the saint initially lived in a cage before building in a cave rather. Damn it! I must be really tired if I initially read it as him living in a cage. Although that wouldn't be that weird for a Christian asset. Like they were to some pretty weird stuff to prove like their devotion to God. He initially lived in a cave before building a church consecrated to the Virgin Mary and Saint John the Baptist. The monastery of the Slavonic Brothers imitated the design of the Abbey of Saint Gall in Switzerland. The main building in the complex was the church, with an adjoining wooden cloister. The original dwelling of the abbot was located on the western side of the courtyard, below the presbytery. The monastery garden is situated in the northern part of the grounds. Here, remnants of the first Sasso stone church, consecrated in 1070 to the Holy Cross, have been unearthed. After the expulsion of the Old Church Slavonic monks from Sasso, the monastery was taken over by Latinist monks from Brevnov. Abbot Detard continued with the rebuilding works, completing a simple single-nave church in his lifetime. From the mid-12th century onwards, works resumed on the original plans, and the abbey church was reconstructed into a massive ornamented three-nave basilica. The oldest simple wooden edifices from the beginnings of the monastery included the cloister, monk quarters, the prelature, abbot's quarters, and the infirmary, the hospital for the monks. The cloister around the Elysian courtyard consisted of a quadrangular hallway with window openings, the monks' dormitory, the chapter house, the study, the refectory, so the dining hall, and kitchen. Okay, Sassau town. Originally Sasava, because I'm pretty sure Sassau is a Germanized version of that name. Originally, Sasava was a settlement on the left bank of the eponymous river, opposite the monastery. For over 100 years, the town was the property of the Benedictine monastery. Houses were centered around the Church of St. Martin, along the road to Prague and Korim. During the Hussite Wars, the monastery and its surroundings fell into the hands of the Hussites, at which time the preacher gave sermons in the Czech language. Building work ceased from then until the mid-17th century, but the monastery survived. For more than 200 years, after the monks were expelled, the monastery lands belonged to the local aristocracy. St. Martin Church. The parish church of St. Martin was founded on the left bank of the Sassau River, in the middle of a small town in the 14th century. It is a single-nave structure with a chancel, a steeple on the north side, and a chapel on the south. The entire complex is enclosed by a high graveyard wall that has survived to this day, although the church building itself has been altered completely, but for the original windows in the steeple. Skalitz. This was probably the first settlement in the area where Skalice lies today, there was probably a settlement in the area where Skalice lies today as early as the 13th century, although there is no mention of the castle until 1361. The development of the town was prompted by silver mining in the area, as well as by the existence of the nearby parish of Rovna. The owners of the castle included Jeszek of Skalitz from 1384 and Bogdal of Drachonice 1401-1403. Wenceslas IV took possession of it in 1403 and placed it under the governance of the knight Seracek Kobela. I wonder if that is a Germanized spelling as well? or because I suppose they changed some of the names because they would be really counterintuitive for English speakers to say, because naturally an English speaker would try to read C as K, but that doesn't happen in Polish or in Czech. So I guess that's why they changed it to Radzik and written it down like that, because it's much easier. But I wonder if it's an actual like what kind of variation of the name is that? Is that a slightly changed phonetic spelling, or is it a German version, German or some other version of that name? Later, the very same year, though, Kabula was forced to flee the castle to protect the inhabitants of Skalitz from King Sigismund's invading army, which torched the castle and the adjoining village. The estate was never renewed thereafter. In December of 1403, Wenceslaus IV granted the remains of the village to Jan Sokol of Lamberg. The ruin of the medieval castle and the fortifications was scavenged for building material for the Church of St. John of Nepomuk in 1630. Today, only minor remains of the gatehouse, only minor remnants of the gatehouse walls, the Zvinga and the perimeter walls remain. Skalitz-Sasau district. The extent of the KCD game world corresponds roughly to the area in southeastern Bohemia around Sasau River, in which many historical sites are located. The most notable include the Sasau Monastery and the castles in the Bohemian Sternberg, Rataje and Skalice. Of the second one, only a few stones can be found today. Talmberg. The castle was built on a rocky promontory at the beginning of the 14th century by Arnost of Kaunitz, Horizonta of Użyc. For more than 200 years, the castle was the seat of the lords of Użyc, who were later renamed after the residents, the lords of Talmberg. In 1390, the castle came into the possession of Divish of Talmberg. The same year, it was seized by Havel Medek of Waldeck, who took Divish prisoner. Medek did not release Divish until 1397, which he was forced to do so by a decision of the provincial court. Only a ruin now remains of the castle, in the midst of residential development. Devil's Furrow. According to historians, the Devil's Furrow was both an ancient and early medieval trade route leading through the Sasau fords and the Elbe River region, all the way down to southern Bohemia. From there, it continued to Danube and northwards to Houghton village. A legend has it that it was made by Saint Procopius after he had yoked a demon to his plough. The road, 21 kilometers long, consists of a massive ditch 14 to 20 meters wide, with a level bottom 2 to 6 meters deep and sloping sides. In some section of the furrow, it even has 2 lanes. Together with several other parallel roads, it connected the fords of the Sasau River with those on the Elbe River, 35 kilometers away. It is exceptional in that it avoids the central area around Prague, unlike other provincial routes of later construction which converge on Prague in a star-shaped pattern. Hence the theory that it originated before Prague became an important city. Užice. The first written mention of Užice, or in KCD Užic, dates back to 1284. Until 1552, ownership of this small town was split between the lords of Talmberg and the lords of Rataje, who eventually became its sole owners. The medieval church of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, built in the 12th century, stands in the center of the village. Missing one location. Entry. Abduction of Wenceslaus IV. Wenceslaus IV was a none too capable ruler, rather than the opposite. During his reign, he was abducted several times in attempt to wrest power from him. The first time, in 1394, he was taken captive in one of his residences in Berun near Prague and taken to Wildberg Castle in Austria. The abduction was engineered by the opposing nobility called the League of the Lords. In 1402, Wenceslaus was abducted for a second time by his half-brother Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, who aspired to the Bohemian throne with the support of the high nobility and incarcerated in Vienna, from where he managed to flee with the help of the loyal nobles in November 1403. Sigismund had in the meantime brought in higher taxes on towns and monasteries. Any towns that refused to submit, he conquered and ransacked. This did not abate even after the death of Wenceslaus. Wait, so what time of the year is it? Like, I assume it's summer because it's rather sunny and the sun sets down at a the dusk falls at a rather late hour. So I guess it's still a couple of months until he escapes, King Wenceslaus escapes. I wonder if I'll hear anything about, like, I don't think so, because I don't think the game will cover that long, but maybe in the epilogue? That's interesting. Battle of Kosovo. Battle of Kosovo took place on June 15, 1389, between the Christian forces led by the Serbian prince Lazar. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Assisted by his compatriot, the noble Vuk Brankovic, and the Bosnian king Samuan I, against the invading armies of the Ottoman Empire, against Sultan Murad I and his sons. It was a decisive battle, although without a clear victor, which strengthened the Ottoman position in the newly conquered territories in Europe. Okay, I don't think this entry makes that much sense. Like, how can it be a decisive battle if there is no clear victor? Anyway, Battle of Nicopolis. The Battle of Nicopolis took place on the 25th of September 1396 between the Hungarian king Sigismund and the Turks, led by Sultan Bayezid. Sigismund's army was made up of soldiers from France, Burgundy, Germany, England, Italy, Bohemia, Poland, and other countries. In all, it was 10 to 15,000 strong. The Ottomans, who at the end of the 14th century controlled the entirety of the Balkans, numbered almost 20,000. The experienced Turkish combatants routed the Christian knights completely, largely because of the Russian and French knights who disobeyed orders and attacked the Turkish vanguard under the misconception that it was the main force, and were subsequently crushed. Those who didn't die on the battlefield were brutally put to death, reportedly up to 3,000 men. The wealthiest were taken prisoner and saved only by paying ransom, which they paid over decades. When the news of the defeat reached Paris, no one believed it, and those who had initially spread the news were put to death by drowning for spreading malicious lies. Well, imagine how stupid those people must have felt after that, when they learned it was actually true, but they already executed a bunch of people for telling what was essentially true all along. The Ottoman victory was a triumph of Islam over Christendom. The Turkish army represented a real threat to the European countries, especially Hungary. The Conquest of Kutenberg. In December 1401, during Wenceslaus' imprisonment in Vienna, Sigismund attacked Kutenberg, and by the beginning of the following year seized and ransacked the town. Kutenberg was loyal to the king and staunchly defended by its miners. When they finally surrendered, they were force-marched to Sigismund's encampment near Kolin and made to kneel before him in the mud in subjugation. In addition, they had to pay huge sums of money in reparation, even though the town and its environs had been pillaged by the Hungarian soldiers. The treasury in Kutenberg held not only coins but also precious jewels, gold and silver. Wenceslas later estimated the wealth seized by Sigismund to be worth 1 million in gold ducats of the day. Now, the thing about sieges in medieval times is that, like, usually if a town defended itself against a siege, the attackers were royally pissed afterwards, and like it was not unheard for people to be like wholesale slaughtered, and there was definitely like a huge amount of actual pillaging, because it was supposed to be a punishment for showing defiance. That's why it was like a trade-off. Whenever an army attacked a city, they offered the defenders the chance to surrender, and for their lives and livelihoods to be spared. Because I imagine there probably would be maybe some pillaging, or also maybe a contribution leveled against whoever lost, even in the case of surrendering. But the trade-off was supposed to be that the attackers wouldn't take casualties from the assault, but the defenders would have like guarantees of safety, provided that they surrender without a fight. So whenever there actually was a siege and like an assault, it was usually extremely bloody, because the attackers they had to make up the sort of effort required to take the city by plundering it. Golden Age of Charles IV. When the young son of John of Luxembourg, Charles, inherited the title of the Moravian Margrave and subsequently the Czech throne, he embarked not only on an economic but also cultural development of his kingdom, a period dubbed the Golden Era. In 1348, Charles founded one of the oldest universities in Europe. Many cities, towns, and castles acquired new fortifications and bridges. Infrastructure and churches were built. To strengthen his position in Europe, he made good use of political marriages, thus allying his family with the prominent families in neighboring countries. He even had influence over the appointment of ecclesiastical dignitaries. Thanks to firm rule and policy based on alliances, he was able to keep peace in Europe. Charles was an educated monarch, interested in the arts, which reflected in the architecture of cities, especially Prague, where under his rule many new houses, churches, including St. Vitus's Cathedral, and the city walls sprang up. Sacking of Skalitz. Little is known about the war in 1402 to 1403, when Sigismund invaded Bohemia and tried to seize power, and the records that do exist are fairly vague. However, we do know the fate of Skalice, which was burned to the ground on March 23rd, 1403. Okay, so that's the date where the game starts. Well, I guess it starts on March 22nd. We know the exact date because a document was preserved that Sigismund signed in that day in the siege camp. Sigismund undoubtedly chose Skalice because silver was mined there, and the town was administered by the royal hetman Racek Kobyla, a supporter of the king. Sigismund apparently wanted to disrupt the flow of money going to Wenceslas. According to legend, Kobyla and his people, who were hiding from the attackers from the castle, were able to escape because a great storm that blew up and forced the besieging army to wait until the morning to take the castle. The castle defenders took advantage of the opportunity and under the cover of darkness fled to the nearby Ratay. In the morning, the only thing Sigismund's men found in the empty castle was a goat. This is also in the game. Sigismund then razed the town and the castle to the ground, and the castle was never rebuilt. And today, only the foundations remain. The Western Schism. The Papal Schism, or the Western Schism, was a rift in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, during which there were two papacies existing simultaneously, one in Rome and the other in Avignon, France. It began in 1368, the year after Pope Gregory IX or rather the 11th. Man, I must be really tired if I can't even I can't even read. After Pope Gregory XI brought the papal court back to Rome from Avignon, where it has resided for almost 70 years due to hostilities between the Roman papacy and the Kingdom of France. When Gregory died, the Neapolitan Bartolomeo Prigano was elected pope with the name Urban VI from 1378 to 1389. He, however, quarreled with the very college of cardinals that had elected him. They therefore declared his election void and elected a new second pontiff, Pope Clement the Seventh, from 1378 to 1404, who re-established the papal court in Avignon and was recognized by Scotland, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal. Siding with the Pope Urban VI in Rome were Italy, Germany, Bohemia, England and Ireland, Flanders, Poland, and Hungary. The schism continued even after the death of the original rival popes, with the election of Boniface IX in Rome from 1389 to 1404 and Benedict XIII in Avignon. From 1394 to 1423, the popes in Avignon were called anti-popes. At this time, European efforts to restore the unity of the Catholic Church were growing. Unfortunately, neither the council nor the popes themselves were able to reconcile, and neither side was willing to budge from their demands. In 1409, the dispute escalated to the point where the cardinals declared both popes to be invalid and elected a third, the anti-pope John the 23rd, from 1410 to 1415. None of the popes submitted to being dethroned, however. The conflict embroiled the rulers of various countries involved, among others the Sigismund of Luxembourg, who took the side of John the 23rd. The Council of Constance was convened on November 5th, 1414 to resolve the issue. The council secured the resignations of the anti-pope John the 23rd and the Roman Pope Gregory XII in 1417, and in 1417 elected a new pope, Martin V, based in Rome. This essentially brought an end to the schism, although there were subsequently two more anti-popes who continued to be supported by a minority, Benedict XIV and Clement VIII, who resigned in 1429, leaving Martin V once again the sole pontiff. Yeah, that's quite a story. Generally, like the history of the Catholic Church and especially the history of the papacy and the various shenanigans that have happened with the elections of popes and with like the reigns were quite crazy. Like there have been instances where like they dug up the corpse of the previous pope to like judge him for something that he has done wrong. Like obviously there have been multiple occasions on which popes fucked everything that moved and had actual concubines and like had huge like parties and feasts and orgies in Rome. So that's quite a story actually. Even from a simple, if you're not a religious man, it's actually quite interesting just from the historical standpoint and from like a sociological standpoint, where those people were supposed to represent the highest moral standard of like a religious leader, but obviously they were just as flawed as everyone else, or maybe even more, because obviously they had access to huge power, which usually draws people who have a chance of, high chance of abusing that power. So let's get to society. Oh man, that's quite a lot of entries in here. Armorsmith. The medieval armorsmith fashioned armor from metal plates or sheets, the cuirass, various pieces for the legs and arms, helmets and gauntlets. Specialists in chainmail armor were called brigadiers, and an ironclad would need both types of armor. The chainmail went underneath and the plate on top. A common soldier would only have partial armor, the breastplate, helmet and gauntlets. A complete suit of armor was beyond his means. Ornate or tailor-made armor was the prerogative of the rich nobility. Plate armor smiths were assisted by polishers who polished or buffed up the armor. Baths and bathmaids where hygiene and bathing was not up to scratch. The public baths were on the rise. Public baths in the Central Europe appeared from about the 12th century. There were baths quite literally in every town, and not in small numbers. Sometimes a town would have 3 to 4 bathhouses. Here, people had access to hot water for bathing and steam baths. In those times, steam was produced by pouring water onto heated bars of iron or stones. Bodily cleanliness was in the care of male and female bath assistants. Fully body washing. What? Shouldn't it be full body washing? Was done in bathtubs, coppered wooden vats and tanks. In Bohemia, there were baths in operation since the early Middle Ages, and the numbers rose steadily. There were 47 public baths in Prague in the second half of the 14th century, and by the 15th, the baths were attended by not only the well-to-do, but also the poorer classes. There were even regulations that the bathkeepers had to open their doors once every quarter to the poor and the students. I like that the students are lumped in with the poor, like as an underclass of people, as some kind of an Untermensch class. Medieval universities actually were quite hilarious as well. Like, for example, in the book by Victor Hugo, how do you say that in Polish? The Cathedral of, how do you say the Virgin Mary is like the most blessed? What? How do you? Let me check that. Let me check how that name even goes, because to be honest, I'm not really sure at this point, which is a bit embarrassing. But obviously that the original title is actually French, which I wouldn't even know how to pronounce, even if I knew it. But oh, interesting. So I guess in English, from what Wikipedia tells me now, the book is actually known as Hunchback of Notre Dame, but in Polish, in Polish and in French, the title itself makes no mention of the Hunchback. It just mentions the cathedral itself. Apparently it's Notre Dame de Paris, so Our Lady of Paris in French. But anyway, in that book, there are quite vivid descriptions of like some medieval shenanigans that the students at the time in Paris were up to. And Hugo, he was a kind of person, he was a writer who like did a lot of research and was a big fan of like digression in his book. He provided a lot of details about like everyday life in the period that his books took place in. So I find it hilarious that the students are lumped in with the poor. Bathhouses typically belonged to the municipality and were leased to the bathkeepers. In addition to municipal and private baths, there were also private baths in the houses of nobility and wealthy townspeople. In the 13th and 14th century, the bathhouses were very much associated with prostitution. In the 13th century especially, bathhouse prostitution became widespread. and there were scarcely any that did not provide sexual services. In the richer urban baths, there would also be pharmacists, massage therapists, stokers and cleaners. In the villages, the bathhouse keeper had to do all of those jobs himself. Now, obviously, that is one of the largest misconceptions about the Middle Ages, because people, for whatever reason, like to assume that people in the Middle Ages liked to be filthy, which obviously they didn't. No person does. Like, people in the Middle Ages did bathe regularly, if not in bathhouses, then, in the river, or, using actual gathering water to clean themselves. Like, it's deranged to assume that for whatever reason that we need some kind of a higher cultural understanding to understand the fact that not bathing for weeks or months at a time is not only unsanitary, it's simply uncomfortable. Like, those were regular people. They weren't some different species. It's not like being dirty for weeks at a time wouldn't bother them. It did, and they did clean themselves regularly. Beekeeping. During the Middle Ages, beekeeping was distinguished by how the honey was obtained, as either forest or domestic. The domestic beekeeper kept bees in hollow trees or in straw skeps, wickerwork hives, and were not subject to any regulation. Conversely, the forest beekeepers, who kept the bee colonies in the wild, in hollowed-out trees, formed a fellowship similar to a guild, and paid a fee to the owners of the woodlands for every bee colony they took over. Beeswax was the main raw material for the production of candles, right after artificial wax, paraffin wax, was invented. Honey was used as a sweetener and fermented to make mead. Beggar. Although beggars were on the margins of society, they had their inedible place in it. In the cities, there were hospitals earmarked for them, and the church also provided assistance. Begging was also allowed at cemetery gates and in front of the churches, and each beggar could occasionally go to the baths at the municipal expense. Some monks were regulars among the beggars too, called almsmen or mendicants. The beggars were well known and tolerated in their communities, but by contrast, it was believed that foreign and wandering beggar brought misfortune. There was seldom any shortage of alms, because charity and gifts to the poor were considered prerequisites for salvation. Blacksmith. Blacksmithing was one of the most important occupations since the earliest times, because iron was a very valuable raw material. In earlier times it was not deep mined, but only acquired from surface mines. Not a piece was allowed to go to waste. People even kept used nails. There was a blacksmith in practically every castle, vicinity or village who forged almost everything that was needed for agriculture: knives, axes, sickles, plows, hoes, etc. Other blacksmiths specialized in making swords, helmets, lances, harnesses fittings, locks and jewelry. The forge was most often a shed with a wall. Its essential equipment consisted of large bellows, an anvil, tongs, hammers, punches, files, etc. In a well-equipped forge, the smith could develop heat up to 1400 degrees Celsius. Butcher. The butcher's profession appears only in the 13th century, because prior to this, every townsman or villager could keep his own livestock and butcher the animals in his own yard. In later centuries, this led to conflicts with professional butchers, leading to the trade of meat being brought under the statute with regards to guild rights. The main tasks of a butcher were to slaughter animals, carve up and portion them, and to preserve the meat outside the town limits. raw meat could not be transported inside the town, and domestic sale was severely punished. These measures were intended to prevent the spread of disease from old or badly processed meat. In time, the Butchers' Guild split into two different specializations, such as those who only work with lard and suet, tallow butchers, small cut specialists, cured meat specialists, and those dealing in horns, hooves, and mucilage. The butcher's craft also spawned tanners, saddlers, and cobblers. Charcoal burner. With growing demand for processed iron, there grew a corresponding demand for charcoal, which could produce a temperature many times higher than unprocessed wood, much needed for the forging of steel weapons. The forges were supplied by charcoal burners, who spent most of the year living in the forest by their charcoal kilns, great piles of stacked wood covered in clay with just a few vents for air, where in an oxygen-starved atmosphere the wood slowly pyrolyzed to charcoal. Each pile would smolder and give off smoke for several weeks, during which time it had to be delved through repeatedly. After it burned out completely, the yield of the process, charcoal, was unearned from beneath the clay. The charcoal was then sold at the special market bearing that name, quite separate from the traders in other goods. During the reign of Wenceslas IV, the charcoal burners had already had numerous rights and freedoms regarding the use of the forests, and were held in a relatively high regard. Resin was also sold exclusively by wagoners and resin merchants, who themselves made pitch for greasing their wheels. The charcoal burners produced resin and pitch only as a sideline. The pitch merchants provided pitch to tanneries to impregnate leather and mixed it in with tallow to grease the axles of wheels on wagons and carriages. Custodian. This was a role, sometimes annual, appointed to the abbot of a monastery or by the abbot of the monastery or a sovereign, similar to the office of the bailiff or a mayor. The custodian's duties included overseeing property premises in which the monarch or the abbot were not continuously resident, but his permanent housing was at his own expense. Executioner. The profession of the executioner dates back to ancient Egypt and Rome, reappearing in Europe in the 13th century. Before this, capital punishment was meted out by judges themselves, or the prosecutors, or the relatives of the condemned, or other persons as suited. Well, really? Relatives of the condemned? That's pretty fucked up, actually. If anything, I would expect it to be the relatives of the victim, because, you know, then they would also get like a degree of vengeful satisfaction from delivering the sentence. But it's pretty fucked up if there existed a period in which you were forced to execute your own relatives were they to be convicted of a crime. It was only with the advent of the executioner that all such tasks were under his remit. Although the executioner, by his profession, came into considerable money, and it was a status symbol for a town to have its own, the hangman or headsman would be a social outcast. From an honest citizen, to make any contact with the executioner was to lose respect, and the executioner himself had to endure a lot of discriminatory measures, sitting at a separate place in the church and in the inn, not taking part in social functions and celebration, etc. The executioner took charge of punishments such as hanging, breaking knees, quartering, burning and torturing, drawing by the horses or beheading. He had his assistants, henchmen, who helped him with preparation and took away the bodies of the executed. Other tasks done by the executioner included the role of a knacker who cleared away animal cadavers, caught stray dogs, and even sometimes just cleaned up filth from the streets. The executioner might have also overseen a town brothel. Yeah, I knew that. was somewhat familiar with surgery, could set broken bones and dislocated limbs or amputate them in the cases of gangrene. Sometimes the executioner sold articles directly related to the execution to the superstitious, for example, the hanging rope, the hangman's fingers, or amulets made from his hair. Farmer. Medieval villages comprised some 90% of the populace. Medieval villages comprised some 90% of the populace, the majority occupied with agriculture and livestock farming. So I guess what the sentence means is that the urbanization level was only 10%. Only 10% of the people lived in cities, which makes absolute sense because, to be honest, in the pre-modern era, it was an enormous effort just to feed the populace. Like, most people had to be farmers to survive. Like, there was no efficient food production back in the day. Even though farmers were freemen and had always owned their homesteads, the land beneath it was on lease from the monarch, or rather from the noblemen who had obtained it from the king in fiefdom. They would pay a portion of their annual earnings in rent, whether in cash, honey, wheat, or other crops. Sometimes they were also required to labor for the nobility, i.e. to work unpaid on farmlands belonging to their liege lords. The territorial diets councils of the 15th and 16th century decreed that the common country folk could not bear arms or engage in hunting. With a special permission from their liege lord, they were allowed to hunt hares or small birds. Fishermen. Fishing was one of the most traditional ways of making a living. Fishing in running water had been done the same way for centuries. Only in the 13th century did monasteries begin to establish fish ponds, particularly for breeding carp. Fish was considered Lenten food, and given the frequency of religious holidays and fasting days, up to 1/3 of the days in the year, they became an essential part of the diet. The greatest boom in fisheries and fish farming in the Czech lands came in the 15th and 16th centuries. Fishing methods made use of various tools and traps, such as bones, wicker baskets, bottomless baskets, fishing line or rod with a hook, and hemp nets with stone weights. All rivers belonged to the king and were leased to towns. Fishing was permitted only on prescribed days and hours. Some noblemen, despite this regulation, banned townspeople from fishing on the pain of death. Nets were set by the day because fishing at night was prohibited. Rod and line fishing was allowed even by those without a net fishing permit, since the catch rate of rod fishing was insignificant. Okay. Gravedigger. The gravedigger took care of the graves and their surroundings, and the occupation was hereditary. The gravedigger would live in a hut in the cemetery itself, next to the main entrance. He did his work not only in the village where he lived, but in the surrounding villages of the parish. Gravediggers were among the pariahs on the margins of the society. The only member of the general populace who came into contact with them was the parish priest. Huntsman. Gamekeeping and hunting in the Middle Ages were not only for amusement, but chiefly as a source of great profit for the king and the nobility who owned the woods. The feudal gamekeepers and huntsmen also undertook woodsmanship. In addition to their obligation to look after the game, they took charge of the forest and its protection. In the forest, it was prohibited to hunt deer, fallow deer, boar, or any other game, violation of which was a criminal act, subject to heavy fines, or in the case of repeated infringements, physical punishment. The same was true for unauthorized logging and collecting of timber. Many poachers came from the ranks of the poor and had not very much to lose, which quite often resulted in physical conflicts with the huntsmen when they were caught red-handed. Journeymen and apprentices. A journeyman was a craftsman assistant. If he went out into the world to ply his trade, he needed to have a vocational certificate and the tools of his trade. Only very rarely did journeymen stay in one workshop for the entire year. Typically, they were just there for a few weeks, on a week's notice, paid by the day, a journey. If a journeyman left without an agreement, absconded, he was proscribed, outlawed from hire by other workshops, his identity written down and disseminated. An apprentice was a boy ceremoniously accepted into apprenticeship by the master craftsman. This entry was made possible after payment of his due fees in cash and beeswax. The wealthy would be taught and would minister for as little as 1 year. The poorer sort would have to pay off their debt by service over several years. Well, in some countries where higher education is not free, it still kind of works this way. You have to pay to be educated, and then usually you have to pay it back because most people, for example, in the US, they actually have to take student loans to afford higher education, and then obviously there's a problem of repaying that if, for example, whatever dream job you had in mind when you went for the university doesn't work out as well as you hoped it would, which I imagine happens quite often. Locksmith. Even though we know of locking systems dating back to ancient times, locksmithing as a separate craft came into being roughly between 1390 and 1408. Before this time, the work was done by blacksmiths. In the rural settlements, even after locksmithing came into its own, the work might still be done by an above-average blacksmith. In the 14th century, the lock was still fitted to the outside of the door, made of iron, and its mechanism was rather complicated. The locksmith decorated the lock cover and keyhole plates. People even regarded their fancy locks as a status symbol until the locksmith amalgamated into guilds and their creativity began to be restricted by security regulations. Malters and brewers. Beer had since the earliest times been brewed by anyone with the know-how. It was only in the 13th century that brewing gradually came to be regulated. The rules stated that beer could only be brewed and sold by a full-fledged citizen who owned a house within the city walls. The right to brew closely relates to the 1 mile right, which dictated that none but the citizens of the town were allowed to conduct urban trades within 1 mile radius of the city. The technical process was supervised by a master brewer. The making of the malt and beer was dealt with by the maltster and brewer, by the maltster, and a brewer handled the fermentation and brewing. In domestic breweries, all those jobs would be done by one man. The shelf life of beer depended on whether the finished brew was filtered or not. Yeast remained in the brew, as well as acetic or lactic bacteria contaminating it. Beer then, quite unlike today, resembled a thick mush and was very nutritious, hence known as liquid bread. It had to be drunk through a straw to filter out foreign matter. Saint Wenceslas was the patron saint of maltsters in Bohemia, while the legendary Gambrinus, though not a saint, was regarded as a patron of brewing. The Bohemian brewing traditions thrive to this day, and Czech beer is among the best in the world. Well, can't comment on that because I don't actually drink beer. Merchant. Merchants were of two types: settled, permanent, and traveling, occasional. The settled traders had permanent shops in towns and villages, while the traveling merchants only brought their wares to the markets. Markets held once a week, and fairs held twice a year, also offered wares by local shopkeepers, visitors and peddlers, or hawkers, street vendors without a fixed site. Shopkeepers had their permanent shops on the square. Merchants ran small shops and had the right to retail products they brought from artisans. Village folk got their supplies from neighboring craftspeople in the local tavern or from a merchant who brought supplies from a larger township. At the market, goods from the village would be exchanged for goods produced and available in the town. In terms of trade, the terms of trade were set by a ruler. For example, that only local merchants in sworn possession of freedom of the city rights could sell their goods freely. Only the traders from large cities could venture abroad. Many regulations, detailed rules governed trade. If it was found that a merchant was dishonest and, for example, gave short weight, he was severely punished. Millers. Milling is one of the oldest crafts in the Czech lands, the construction of water mills being well known since the earliest times. Over the centuries, the mechanism was perfected, and in the Middle Ages, there was a mill in practically every village. There were also windmills or mills powered by oxen or horses. Milling was one of the so-called freelance professions. They conducted trade in the village, among other roles. With the increasing number of water mills and other water-powered equipment, there was a need to settle relationships between the various millers. Already by the mid-14th century, an association of the provincial millers, experts in the field of water rights, was set up, with powers to survey watercourses, stipulate the scale of mill earthworks, assess the technical conditions of mills, and so on. They also drew up a code of conduct for millers, as to ensure their use of water for milling caused no loss to others. Since the mills stood apart from the other village houses, millers were often the subject of gossip and were accused of earning money on the side through nefarious means, from selling customers short on flour to outright witchcraft, thievery, and trafficking in stolen goods. The latter accusations, in particular, were certainly defamatory and without a grain of truth. Did a miller write this entry? Did Miller Peszek write it? Noble officials, hetman, originally the commander in some armed forces, with a rank equivalent to captain. Later the role became that of a civic governor, selected from amongst the local nobility, who represented the monarch in a given territory. Hofmeister, from the German Hof, meaning a court or a manor, the hereditary office of the royal court. He was responsible for the management of the court. Under-chamberlain. Along the chancellor, the under-chamberlains, in the Latin subcameriarus, was a member of the office who represented the sovereign in royal cities, such as proto-notaries or notaries, burgrave, the representatives of the sovereign and his representative of provincial officials of knightly status. His duties included management of the city and leading the army when needed. Painter. During the Middle Ages, no one knew who the names of the artists who painted the panels and frescoes. And the bulk of their work remains anonymous to this day. Often the paintings were undertaken by monks who decorated their monasteries alongside illuminating manuscripts. The painters and illuminators made their own pigments from ground natural materials. Their themes were mainly historical, biblical, or geometrically decorative. Yeah, I think the thing with not signing your handiwork was that it was viewed as vain. It was viewed as vain to advertise, a work of art that you did. It was supposed to sort of defend itself by its quality, rather than specifically bring fame to a particular name. Pharmacist. The apothecary prepared medication according to a carefully studied prescriptions that were passed down through generations. It was one of the few professions that was not organized into guilds. The production of medicaments was quite hard work and a great responsibility. The apothecary had to have studied at the university and would be schooled not only in Latin but also in Greek. He had to be able to carefully measure out precise dosages of medication and ensure the ingredients were always available. If there was no apothecary in town, there would be the monastery infirmary, and if that was not available, people turned to the services of herb women, lay herbalists, quack healers, or medicasters called charlatans. Their methods of healing were controversial because in making lotions and potions, they would make use not only of herbs but also of spells, amulets, and sometimes even very unusual raw materials such as frog poison or hangman's finger. Priests. The priests were among the elite in the medieval society and among the few who had any education. Village priests were less educated than those of the larger parishes. They could barely read or write, had no library, and learned the liturgy by heart. They were none too well off, typically working in the fields or raising livestock like lay farmers. They were not celibate, enjoyed folk entertainment and games and going to the tavern. As the time went on, looser morals and educational decline spread to the towns and monasteries. By contrast, the priests in larger parishes and towns owned more property, and with the exception of service to God, they did not have to resort to any manual work. The duties of the priest encompassed preparation and serving of Mass, hearing confessions, taking care of the church, its operation and decoration, visiting the poor and the sick, arranging charity collections, collecting dues, conducting baptisms, weddings, last rites and funerals. Prostitution. In Bohemia, the brothel was called Hampes, whorehouse, or the house of shame, but not a brothel as such. Prostitutes were simply whores. The profession encompassed several categories. The most deprived prostitutes were the homeless women who provided services in the streets. Others visited customers in their homes, disguised as bread sellers, yet others were available to noble and royal courts. Then were those who proffered their services in brothels of various price categories, whose clients were townsmen, officials and nobles, or conversely, the most menial clientele in the most down-market establishments. Brothels were run not only by the townspeople, but even by the spiritual leaders or prelates. For example, the parish priest of the Church of Saint Gilles under Visegrad. What? Priests run brothels? I have to check, I have to double check that. That seems pretty weird, especially if they were doing so semi-openly. Often a brothel was directly connected to a bathhouse. During the Hussite Wars, many brothels were abolished, but boomed again soon afterwards. Their legalization was also helped by the Church of Rome, which considered prostitution a lesser evil than adultery. It speaks volumes that prostitutes accounted for almost 10% of the population of the Papal Rome. There were numerous regulations and laws governing brothels and the oldest profession, and even a special tax. There were even laws covering considerate treatment of prostitutes and protecting them from violence. Really? Sounds pretty interesting. Although, also, I am a bit weirded out by the distinction, because if you were going to a brothel while married, that's still adultery? So, I don't quite get the distinction here. Scribe. His main activity was to keep the records of the territorial court and the meetings of the city council. He was one of the few in medieval society who knew how to read and write, making his services welcome in almost every city. Shepherd, a herder's job dependent on the weather, most commonly starting in April and ending in autumn. They took the entrusted herd or flock. It was very rarely their own. More commonly, they were hired to supervise the grazing of other livestock for a fee. From pasture to pasture, sleeping in rudimentary huts or shelters. Over the summer, they stayed out in pastures, returning to the village when the first frost set in. Life far away from other people forced the herders to become adept at healing themselves and their animals, so that when there was no apothecary to hand, folks would turn to the shepherd. Smuggler. In the Middle Ages, smuggling was regarded as taking any goods in or out of a town without paying export or import duties. Smugglers had to know alternate routes and how to avoid the tax collectors. When smuggling through the gates, they made use of false-bottomed vehicles or baskets, or even resorted to climbing over the walls by night. Contraband included fabrics, spices, wine, and other less freely available goods, subject to high taxation. Stonemason. Stonemasons were engaged in the quarrying and dressing of stone. Their activities include quarrying stone blocks from the rock face, splitting them into smaller pieces, grinding, cutting, polishing and dressing them to make building blocks or vault elements. The first mention of an organized stonemasons guild in Bohemia dates back from the 14th century. The patron saints of quarriers and stonemasons are Saint Roch and Saint Joseph, and in places also Saint Barbara and Saint Procopius. Stoneworking found application mainly in the construction industry. Mason's mark. The mason's mark was a graphic symbol, though not the maker's signature, on the surface of a finished stone piece. The number of finished and marked pieces determined the payment due. Each mason either attained his mark or had it allocated to him at a particular point in his apprenticeship and then kept it for life. Okay, so apparently masons did sign their work, kind of, and I imagine it might have also been useful in determining, if the stone was faulty and like the building crumbled or was damaged, you would know who to blame, right? Because it bore the mark of the mason who supplied the stone. Swordsmiths and armorers. Swordsmiths were originally blacksmiths, blacksmith cutters, specializing in blades for swords, knives, daggers, and other handheld sidearms. In the 14th century, the making of armor began to specialize and separate out from the blacksmith's craft. Specialist professions came into being: armorers, bladesmiths, and bassinetters, who not only produced but also sold their wares. As regards to weapons, there were also new specialized professions: the swordsmith, bladesmith, fletcher, arrowsmith, and in the later centuries the gunsmith, bowyer, or shieldsmith, making wooden and metal shields. The price of a complete suit of armor was very high, affordable only to wealthy noblemen. Those who could not afford a suit of armor would only have partial metal armor and would rely on their agility for protection in combat. Tailor and draper. Until the 13th century, the tanners sold their wares for processing to sutures and cobblers. Cloth was made by weavers, but traded by drapers, who also often cut and sold it by the cubit, the length of a forearm. Only later, during the High Middle Ages, did tailors could cut pieces into garments. Simple garments were sewn by women themselves for their families. It was an issue to make sure that the garments were well sewn, since they were inherited and would often last for decades with only minor repairs. By the beginning of the 14th century, people in larger cities were paying even more heed to fashion. A tailor would begin to specialize in only one kind of garment. Hence we find coat makers, hosiers, hood makers, gantiers, hatters, and cape makers, and those who did alterations and repairs to old clothes. In the town the size of Ratay, the tailor had to turn his hand to general purpose work. Tanner. The tanner was a craftsman who prepared and treated animal skins, after which he passed them on to cobblers, saddlers, and other craftsmen for making footwear, garments, bags, wineskins, and so on. It was not a pleasant job, because the skin had to be quickly scraped off its fat and conserved to stop it going off, which was done by immersing it in urine. Oh, okay, I didn't know that part. So I guess that also contributes to the smell. Like, I thought it had more to do with like the viscera itself and, you know, cleaning off the skins. But then, you know, if you have vats of piss standing around everywhere with the skins in them, I can imagine how that would make other people not very keen on spending time with you. In view of the unsavory smells produced by their trade, tanners settled on the outskirts of town and belonged to the same reviled group as the executioners, knackers, and prostitutes. To turn hide into a material for making shoes and clothing, after the removal from the animal, it must first be thoroughly soaked in water. Once softened, it's fleshed. The residual gore and membranes are scraped off with a long, dull paring knife. In order to rid the hide of fur, it had to be soaked in lime water or rubbed with slaked lime and then scudded. It was then tanned using alum by a courier, with fish oil by the chaussier, or with tannis dealt with by the tanner from oak, beech, or other tree bark. During this, a whole lengthy process, the hide softened, was stopped from decomposing and optionally turned to a different color. At the end of the process, the hides were submerged for a few weeks in vats or pits full of urine. Few weeks, huh? I can't even begin to imagine how does few weeks worth how does few weeks old urine smell? Like, regular urine smells bad enough, you know. And not to mention, it will also mix with the residue from the skin itself, I imagine. The leather thus produced was then dried and could be surface treated, painted, or polished. Taverns, inns, and innkeepers. The Czech word for tavern, hospoda, might originate from the Latin hospes, guest, hospitium, hospitality, or shelter, though more likely the etymology is from the Old Slavonic gospod, gospodia, the master of the house. Alehouses were an integral part of all medieval villages. Originally, beer was drawn in from what was called the mass house, an area of the grounded floor of the townhouse, whose owner had brewing rights, with special purpose taverns and inns coming along later. These served as places for social meetings, events, trading, and lodgings. Some inns had rooms for overnight guests, and special tables, stables, and spaces for carriages. Those were called wagoners' inns, and were located out of town at crossroads and along trade routes. The seating was most often outdoors than indoors. It was said of Wenceslas IV that he was fond of visiting taverns and alehouses to eavesdrop on what the locals had to say about him, and to check that the owners were complying with his edicts. In the Middle Ages, no one took exception to alcohol. The Germans, Russians, and Czechs in particular were Europe's fabled drinkers. There was a formal curfew at dusk, or when the night watchman began his rounds, although drinking and feasting often went on until the early morning hours. In KCD, we have tried to keep the image of a medieval tavern faithful to surviving records. Okay, that's actually kind of an interesting thing, that the king himself, like going around the taverns and listening on gossip, of what people were saying about his reign. Although, to be honest, if I were him, I wouldn't be doing that, considering he was kidnapped a couple times in his life. like being kidnapped even once would probably leave me with quite a PTSD. Town garrison. Maintaining law and order in the medieval town was the job of the bailiff. From the 14th century onwards, the function was taken over by the catchpole, the night watchman, and guards on towers. The catchpole, alongside with the bailiff, the executioner and their henchmen, also carried out the punishments on transgressors. They were not, however, allowed to enter freehold dwellings, the palaces and houses of the nobility, nor church buildings or the university, a fact students took advantage of. Yeah, because universities had like a limited form of autonomy, like they were actually like a separate region, so almost from the town in which they are, in which they stood. Order within a city had also to be upheld by the townsfolk themselves. They were obliged to report not only any crime, but just like the night watchman, to call out the hours and warn of fire, flood, or tempest. For safety, it was forbidden to wander at night with any open flame, torch or candle, into any castles, chambers, stables, barns or byres. Only lanterns would be used. To keep the peace at night, all taverns had to be shut at sunset. In the medieval city, military service was entrusted either to hired professionals or the townspeople themselves. Every healthy adult male had to serve at least a few days a year in the civic guard, the city walls being divided and allocated in sections to each district or trade, and it was hence that they mustered whenever an alarm was raised. In practice, the wealthy burghers bought their way out of serving in the militia, leaving other men to take their turn, and those poorer men welcomed the extra income, thus gradually forming the professional municipal gendarmerie. Each man had to procure the armor and weapons needed for serving in the guards and the militia, unless his guild did so. Only the rich cities could afford to have a public issue armory. The right to bear arms outside of duty was reserved for the townspeople of sufficient means. Within the city walls, as simple melee weapons, dagger or knife had to suffice. Only the really wealthy townsmen wore swords, taking after the nobility. Waldensians. The Waldensian movement first appeared in the second half of the 12th century in Lyon, France. Its founder was a wealthy Lyon merchant, Peter Valdo, also called Pierre Valdez, who gave up his worldly goods and returned to his former poor apostolic life. The main characteristics of the movement were voluntary poverty, strict interpretation of the scriptures, and above all, criticisms of the materialism of the church. They regarded relics of the saints as mere human remains of uncertain origins, icons and sacred statues as object of idolatry, and held that mass said in a barn was as valid as in any consecrated church. Valdo even translated the Holy Scripture into Arpitan, a French dialect of Provence, and preached using this translation. The movement was soon after its founding. It gained a following in Provence, as well as the neighboring Lombardy. The sect was sometimes known as the Lyon Poor or the Lombardy Poor. The emergence of the sect did not escape the watchful eye of the Vatican, and in 1179, Peter Valdo and his associates were invited to Rome to explain their opinions and actions before the Holy See and respond to theological questions. The outcome of the questioning is not clear, but the movement continued its activities and preached in ever greater opposition to the Roman Church until 1184, when the entire sect was excommunicated by the Synod of Verona and its members expelled from Lyon. Nevertheless, Waldensians continued to endure thanks to its strict secrecy. Their communities were were linked together by traveling preachers who visited members' houses. The members of the sect were obliged to hide the preachers from pursuit, feed and house them, and ensure them safe passage to their next destination. Thus decentralized, the Waldensians preserved long after the death of their founder, sometimes in the 13th century, probably in what is today Germany. The Waldensians came to Bohemia primarily with German colonists, who undoubtedly were often fleeing persecution, but even in Bohemia they did not escape systemic persecution, and by the end of the 15th century the movement was suppressed throughout Europe, with the exception of the Cottian Alpine region between Piedmont and Provence, where they still remained a compact community. At the end of the 1590s, the Waldensians joined the Genevan Reformation and became part of the Europe-wide Protestant movement. Wine grower. In Bohemia, wine growing began to spread from the 10th century onwards, due especially to liturgical reasons. Between the 11th and the 13th centuries, vineyards were mainly for monasteries and nobility, generally in similar places to where we find wine grown today, mainly in southern Moravia. Due to the more favorable climatic conditions, vineyards could for a period thrive even in Bohemia, but later, after a global cooling period, they died off again. Taking care of vines kept winters occupied all year round, the vintage harvest taking place from October to November, depending on the weather. Wine tended to be grown in places unsuitable for cultivation of other plants, such as on rocky south-facing slopes. It could take 3 to 4 years to establish a vineyard, and it would be good for 30 to 40 years. The grapes were harvested and put into vats when they were crushed by threading. The white grapes were pressed immediately after crushing, and the juice kept in wooden barrels, tarred and sanitized with sulfur, where the wine was left to ferment. Red grapes were crushed, then seeds removed, and left to ferment in open vats, stirred regularly. This produced what is termed the mash, and after a few days, this was pressed and the juice poured into barrels. King Charles IV was a great wine lover who imported grapevines from France together with wine-growing know-how and granted numerous privileges to vintners. Woodcutter. During the early Middle Ages, agriculture and rapid growth of towns took its toll on forests with massive clearings. There was no reforestation done in those days, so in the 15th century, some areas had even less forest cover than today, while the towns themselves were surrounded by zones of outright devastation. Logging was done by woodcutters. Their basic tool was a large single-sided axe on a long handle or haft, while various wooden wedges and hammers were used to split the lumber. Transportation of lumber from distant areas was difficult, which led to using navigable waterways, down which the lumber was left to drift freely. Okay, so that's all the things in this category. Let's go to characters. Albert IV of Habsburg. Albert IV of Habsburg was an Austrian count, son of Albert III, with whom he fought against King Wenceslas IV in the beginning of 1394. He also had disputes with Prokop of Luxembourg over the Czech-Austrian border. He lived from 1377 to 1404. Charles IV, from 1316 to 1378. Charles IV of Luxembourg, born Wenceslas, son of King John of Luxembourg, was the second member of the Luxembourg dynasty to become the King of Bohemia from 1346 to 1378, and the first to attain the title of the Holy Roman Emperor from 1355 to 1378. He held many other titles besides: Margrave of Moravia, Count of Luxembourg, King of Italy, King of the Romans, and King of Burgundy. Renowned for his diplomatic skills and erudition, He actively endeavored to consolidate his position and ensure the survival of his line in Europe, especially in Bohemia, Moravia and Germany. He was well versed in several languages, and at French court he was tutored by none other than the future Pope Clement VI. During his reign, Prague and the lands of the Bohemian crown underwent a major transformation, becoming powerful political, economic and cultural centers. For this reason, this period of his reign is known as the Golden Age. He initiated a construction of many superb edifices, which thus bear his name, including Charles University, Charles Bridge, and the Karlstein Castle. He was keen to emphasize the role of religious faith in society. He renewed the cults of Saint Wenceslaus, Saint Sigismund and Saint Vitus, consecrating various churches buildings to them, among others Prague Cathedral. He married 4 times and had 13 children, most of whom died in infancy. The most illustrious of his offspring were his sons Wenceslaus and Sigismund, who both became rivals over the lands of the Bohemian crown. Cumans. The Cumans first arrived in the Czech lands in 1260. Under the leadership of the Hungarian crown prince Stefan. They fought against Bishop Bruno and the army of the Austrian lords, which they thoroughly vanquished. The Cumans appeared for a second time in 2070s when they defeated the army of King Przemysl Ottokar and went on to pillage Moravia. They last invaded the Czech lands under Sigismund of Luxembourg, who could not afford better mercenaries than the Cumans. Estimates speak of several thousand fighters. One of the places that succumbed to the ravages was Silver Skalitz, the birthplace of our game's hero. Jobst of Moravia, from 1354 to 1411. Jobst of Moravia was the Margrave of Moravia from 1375 and the Elector of Brandenburg from 1388. He also held the throne of the King of the Romans, although he did so for a mere 15 weeks until his death. He was the son of John Henry of Luxembourg and the nephew of Emperor Charles IV. He achieved his standing in Europe due to political and military intrigues aimed primarily against members of his own dynasty, particularly Wenceslaus IV, against whom he rebelled, along with the Moravian forces in the so-called Margravite Wars. He initially supported Sigismund of Luxembourg's efforts to seize the Bohemian crown, but in 1403 he began opposing him, and together with Albert IV, Duke of Austria, he took part in a rebellion against him. His previous support for Sigismund was probably motivated by self-interest. It ensured him future influence as long as it seemed that Wenceslaus would be deposed and Sigismund, or even Jobst himself, would take his place. His campaign against Wenceslaus won him and other nobles many privileges. Then, in 1402, when the situation changed, he rebelled against Sigismund and was even instrumental in liberating Wenceslaus from captivity. We don't know whether the chance was due to cunning or conscience, but at the end, to the end of his life, he remained surprisingly loyal to Wenceslaus IV. Towards the end of his life, he even stood against Sigismund in the election of the King of the Romans and won. He didn't enjoy the crown for very long though, and died shortly after. Jobst was not only politically astute, but also a very thrifty governor. Many rulers, including Sigismund himself, were financially indebted to him. In his day, it was said that it was Jobst, and not either Wenceslaus or Sigismund, who was the true uncrowned sovereign of Bohemia. At the time that our game takes place, however, he was in debt up to his ears. Jan Hus. Jan Hus, from 1370 to 1415, was a priest and a thinker, and one of the most important Czech religious reformers and preachers. His works, inspired by the theological writings of John Wycliffe, played a key role in the underpinning of the essence of the Reformation. As of 1398, He worked and disseminated his teachings in Prague University, but as early as 1403, German professors there labeled him a heretic. 6 years later, up to 20,000 doctors, masters and students were forced to leave Prague University as a result of theological disputes. From 1402, Hus preached at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, where all sermons were delivered not in Latin but in Czech. This place became the center of the Reformation in Bohemia. Because of his controversial relationship with the Church and opinions on Catholic ethics, Hus was persecuted and finally convicted of heresy by the Council of Constance, for which he was burned at the stake. The followers of the reformist idea railed together after the events of Constance, leading to the beginning of the Hussite Wars from 1420 to 1434. And I guess, is this him already burning? Like, there is fire in the background, but he's surprisingly calm for someone being burnt at the stake. So I assume that's not the moment, but still, there is fire. Pope. The Pope is the supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church, Jesus Christ's deputy on earth, and cannot be removed from office. His word is regarded by the Church as infallible, equivalent in effect to the Holy Scripture. At the time of our game, however, nothing was quite so straightforward. During the Papal Schism that lasted from 1378 to 1417, there was for a time as many as 3 rival claimants to the throne of St. Peter. For secular rulers, support for one claimant or the other was often less a question of faith than a political convenience. Pope Urban VI, from 1318 to 1389. Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Prignano, was quickly elected pope under the pressure from the Roman people to have a citizen of their city at the papal throne, and the papacy returned there from Avignon, to which it had been relocated at the beginning of the century by the French king. Urban truly did begin to rule from Rome, and once he took office, also to criticize the cardinals for accepting gifts from rulers and living in luxury. This made him many enemies, so shortly after the French cardinals declared his election invalid and elected a new pope, who once again ruled from Avignon. The new pope declared Urban to be the Antichrist and excommunicated him. This led to the Great Schism, financial, theological and political duality and chaos throughout Europe, because each ruler had to declare which pope they recognized as the head of the church. Benedict XIII, from 1328 to 1423. Benedict XIII, born as Pedro de Luna, was elected anti-pope in 1394 in Avignon. He had previously withdrawn his allegiance to the Italian Pope Urban VI, who represented the Catholic Church in Rome. Pope Boniface IX, from 1356 to 1404. Pope Boniface IX, born Pietro Tomicelli, was pontiff from 1389, contemporaneously with the Avignon antipopes Clement VII and Benedict XIII. He also refused to abdicate, leading not only to the continuation of the Western Schism, but also to the ever-deepening rift in the Church. However, it also meant that Boniface had a growing influence on some aspects of secular power. Pope Clement VII, from 1342 to 1394. Clement VII, born as Robert of Geneva, was the first anti-pope elected by the French cardinals in opposition to the Roman Pope Urban VI, as an expression of their disagreement with the Italian pontiff's decision to remove the seat of the papal power from Avignon, as well as his views that the clergy should lead more austere and virtuous lifestyle. This event caused the Western Schism, which split the papacy. Racek Kobyla of Dwoic. Racek, in KCD Radzik Kobyla, was a Bohemian yeoman, the royal hetman of Wenceslas IV, and between 1410 and 1415, the Burgrave of Vyšehrad. In 1403, he resided in the castle of Silver Skalic, Srebrne Skalice, where he oversaw the mining of silver. The king was known for his generosity to lower nobles who received high titles for their loyalty. Racek Kobyla was apparently one of these, and probably the king's friend. In 1403, Skalic was besieged and burned to the ground by King Sigismund and his Cuman army. For his service and loyalty, King Wenceslas IV allowed Racek to build his own castle at Wrzeli nad Wazawą. Standing at this site today is Chateau Komornych Radek. He was killed in 1416 in a tavern in Kutna Hora by a mob of miners, incited by preachers. A year after the burning of Jan Hus, they seized him in the inn where they were staying, cut their bodies into pieces and threw them out onto the street, where the mob vigorously stomped on the remains, and then went in merry song to the home of the preacher to be praised for the act, and for the act they had been encouraged to commit. This occurred when Racek was there to collect taxes for the king, which is odd because 6 years earlier he had apparently been a robber knight, and soldiers had been dispatched against him as a scourge of the land. Sources are not clear as to why he was later rehabilitated for services to the king. Okay, that's actually that's kind of funny how history is kind of spoiling the game for me, because Racek more or less seems like an okay guy, so it's weird to see that he later in life turned into robbery, being a robber knight, and also it saddens me that he was torn to pieces by an angry mob over a tax collecting job. So yeah, that's a bit of a spoiler history. Sigismund of Luxembourg, from 1368 to 1437. Sigismund of Luxembourg, son of Charles IV, was the king of Hungary and Croatia from 1387, king of Germany from 1411, king of Bohemia from 1419, and king of Italy from 1431. He was also the Prince of Silesia from 1419 and the Margrave of Lusatia, and most notably the Holy Roman Emperor between 1433 and 1437. At the early age, he was sent to be educated at the Hungarian court, quickly mastering the tough conditions of politics. Like other members of his family, he was abducted at least once, in this case by the Hungarian nobility. Having lost his faith in the Hungarian nobility, he turned his attention to Bohemia and became engaged in hostilities with his half-brother Wenceslas. Some of the Bohemian nobility welcomed Sigismund, hoping he would rid them of their ineffective monarch, while others sided with Wenceslas, resulting in long-lasting wars, in the course of which Sigismund and his Hungarian army, consisting in no small part of Cuman mercenaries, repeatedly pillaged Bohemia, often with the help of the Bohemian and especially Moravian lords themselves. Sigismund not only fought to seize his brother's throne, but also against the Hussites, with the aim of seizing the imperial crown. He regarded himself as the defender of Christianity, and in 1409 even founded the Order of the Dragon to wage war against all enemies of the Christian faith. One of the later members of the order was the infamous Vlad the Impaler, inspiration for the fictional Dracula. After the death of Wenceslas, Sigismund brought to Bohemia 4 unsuccessful crusades against the Hussites. He died soon after signing the Compacts, a set of agreements with the reformers guaranteeing freedom of religious belief to every inhabitant of the lands of Bohemia and Moravia. Sir Marquard von Aulitz. 1360 or 70 to 1402. What? That doesn't make sense, by all accounts. He should be dead then. Like, what is he doing in this game? Like, he died before Skalitz was even raised? What? He was the hetman or the governor of Prague, who, much like those members of nobility disgruntled with the reign of Wenceslas IV, saw in Sigismund of Luxembourg a better potential king. Their motivation had more to do with money and power. Wenceslas offered them no prospects, while supporting Sigismund promised them a better future position in society. The Ronov family, one of the oldest and most notable of Czech aristocratic dynasties, the family expanded into numerous branches and generations, such as the lords of Dauba, Berka, and the Lichtenburgs, Kriniec of Ronov, and so on. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the family split into the lords of Lipa, the Lichtenburgs, the lords of Dauba, and the lords of Klingenstein, and more. The oldest known member of the dynasty was the late 20th century Smil Svetlik of Duhan. His descendants carried high office in the royal court, thus acquiring considerable tracts of land, from which they acquired their family name. From Ronov in the Žitava period, in the Žitava region, the Nice River Valley in present-day Poland. What? I might be stupid, but I don't know the English names of the Polish, geographical landmarks and features. Ah, okay, that's Nysa. Okay. I was trying to determine which river is that in Poland. But that's that's removed enough that it confused me at first. Removed enough from the Polish spelling. Ronov Castle of the same name, south of Česká Lipa, was built only at the end of the 14th century. The Ronov family is represented by one of the KCD characters, Hanusz z Lipy, Henry of Lipa. Henry I of Lipa was one of the founders of the noble family, which took its name from the settlement of Lipa, today Česká Lipa. He held various positions and high office at the royal court, sub-chamberlain, Marshal of Bohemia, and provincial hetman of Bohemia and Moravia simultaneously. In 1315, he was charged with conspiracy for drafting a document against the king and thrown in prison. He was released half a year later, thanks to the support on part of the nobility and the Dowager Queen, Elizabeth Rycheza of Poland, who was his lifelong partner. This situation forced John of Luxembourg to launch a campaign with German troops against the Czech nobility. The conflict came to an end in 1318. He spent the last years of his life in Brno, where he has established his own court. The coat of arms of the Lords of Lipa consists of a cross made of 2 tree branches. Henry had 3 daughters, Clara, Marketa, and Katarina, and 4 sons, Henry the Iron One, Jindřich Żelazny, Jan, Bertold, and Chenek. They too all held positions of high office. Okay. Jan Berdy Jesek. Jan Jesek, father of the young lord Jan Ptacek, Hans Kapon, was a Moravian lord. In 1349, he became the lord of Honowice estates, and in 1356 the lord of Polna Castle, which he acquired in exchange for the Slope Castle, Pirkstein, in 1369, Lord of Rataje, where he built a new parish church. And renamed the lower castle of Pirkstein. His son John was still a minor when he died, so the property was administered by his relatives. It did not pass back into the hands of his rightful heir until 1412. Jacek was the first of the lords of Lipa to hold the moniker Birdie Ptaszek. But why? I would like the game to explain that to me. If he had such a such a nickname, where does it come from? And why is Jan Ptaszek called Hans Capon in this game? I guess a capon is that's a bird, right? That is. Although, isn't that like a type, like a different name for a rooster, for a male chicken? That's a pretty weird surname, all things considered, and I don't know why they changed that name so significantly. Again, I suppose it was probably because they wanted to make it easier for English native speakers. The underage son of Jan Jacek Ptaszek and Hedwika of Dauba, after the death of his father, his family, the lords of Lipa, his uncle Jindrich, his son Hanush, and his brothers became his guardians. Young Lord did not take possession of Rataje, an hereditary estate in Polna, until 1412. Soon afterwards, he entered political life and held positions in the provincial offices. After the imprisonment of Master Jan Hus, he signed a petition in his defense, but during the Hussite Wars, he was initially on the side of the League of Lords against the Hussites in the few minor battles. In 1419, he took part in a battle against the Hussites at Kinin, apparently due to the influence of his close neighbor Lacek of Kravar of Sternberg. There are no records indicating he took part in the war later. His son was Hiniek Ptaszek, who achieved high office in the Kingdom of Bohemia, becoming Royal Hofmeister and Mincemaster. Sir Hanusz of Lipa, following the death of Jindrich III of Pirkstein, Henry III, in 1402, Hanusz of Lipa, in KCD Hanusz of Lipa, became the guardian and the former son, Jan Ptaszek, in KCD Hans Capon, and thus the acting governor of the surrounding province. He completed the construction of Pirkstein and its fortifications, and the local church of St. Matthew, which contains a shrine to his family. When Sigismund of Luxembourg invaded and burned Skalice, the town's burggrave, Racek Kobyla, and the survivors of the raid found refuge with Hanusz. Hanusz subsequently took action against the scattered groups of brigands and Kumans. His relationship with the king was peculiar, to say the least. Judging by the often contradictory sources, it appears that in 1410, crown forces descended on the town of Rataje in Hanusz's domain, probably after he became a robber baron and a rebel, who may have also participated in the siege of Żichawa in Moravia. Nevertheless, in 1414, he became a provincial marshal and dwelt together with his wife Margreta of Sternberg at Spilberg in Brno. The Zul family of Ostradek. The story of the Zul yeoman family aptly illustrates the conditions that existed in Bohemia at the turn of the century. Even before the king's abduction, Bohemia was crawling with all sorts of bandit fellowships and fraternities, often led by the lower nobility. Execution records mention that the Zul family name as of 1389, when Jan Zul and his father Mikulas Zul are mentioned as leaders of a band of brigands that perpetrated pillaging raids from their base in Ostradek. They were sometimes joined by Jan's uncle Hagen from the nearby fortress of Kreshice. Their territory of operation consisted mostly of trade routes between Prague, Kutna Hora, Kutenberg, and Bresnov, as well as solitary mills. In fairness, it must be added that the testimony of individual captured bandits or their associates implicated many millers and innkeepers from the surrounding villages of receiving stolen goods from bandits or assisting them in other ways. These stolen goods were indeed varied in character. We learn from the execution books that the Zuls stole horses, cattle and farm equipment, as well as merchandise such as cloth and barrels full of herring. Of course, money was also highly desirable loot. Around the turn of the century, the Zul band seized Chechanov Castle and extended their hunting ground. At the same time, they also fought with Prokop of Luxembourg in his campaign against Sigismund, which nicely illustrates the attitude of the day to the criminality of the nobility. There was indeed a thin line between a mercenary and a bandit, very often depending on allegiances. It may have been on account of Prokop that the Zuls plundered especially in the lands of Sigismund's allies from the Rosenberg family. Little wonder then that most of the records we have about the Zuls come from the Rosenberg's execution books, which depict them in unflattering light. In 1401, they abducted a parish priest from a Rosenberg village, preferably in the expectation of a fat ransom, and later they further expanded their property by seizing Duba Castle, which belonged to their former allies. The Zul pillaging raids were only brought to an end by a punitive expedition by the Prague bishop Zbigniew Zajec of Hasenburg, Hare Castle, who conquered both Duba and Chechanov. He then brought Miklas Zul and about 50 of his companions in captivity to Prague. Jan, the youngest of the Zuls, was captured and executed a year later. The bishop divided the Zuls' numerous properties, which included villages, woods and farms, amongst his allies, and left the family's descendants quite destitute. Chechanov Castle was reduced to ruins during a punitive raid. It has passed through the hands of several courtiers before becoming the property of Racek Kobyla in 1411. Kobyla built a new seat there called Komorny Hradek. The fate of Miklas Zul after his captivity is also interesting, because he was escorted to the gallows by none other than Jan Hus and hanged along with his comrades. According to the chronicles of the time, the only concession accorded to his noble status was that he was hanged higher than the other outlaws. His body was then displayed hanging on a hook. The chronicles mention that 7 years later, a madman with compulsion for burying executed convicts was wandering around Prague. Because he was unable to remove Zul's remains from the hook, he took at least one leg, and with a female grocer who later saw to a proper burial of the body of Mikulas Zul, albeit not in one piece, it was finally laid to eternal rest behind the church of Saint Stephen in Rybniczek, where it was customary at the time to inter executed individuals. Actually, how much would even be left of a body after 7 years in temperate climate? Wouldn't it be bones at this point? Well, I guess it doesn't specifically mention that his body still had flesh on it. It could have been just bones. Lords of Talmberg. The coat of arms of the Lords of Talmberg consists of 2 water lily leaves, argent, silver, on a field gules, red. The dynasty dates back to 1291, when the Talmberg castle was under construction under the administration of Willem, son of the then Prague Burgrave, Hrosnata of Užice. His descendants later owned estates in South and East Bohemia, including Slatinane, Milicin, and the area around Czaslav. Some of the Talmberg lords achieved such influential posts in the administration as the Burgrave or the magistrate. Sir Divish of Talmberg, Divish Talmberku, owned Talmberg Castle in the years 1390 to 1415. In 1391, the castle was conquered and Divish was taken captive by his neighbor Havel Medek of Waldeck, though we no longer know how the dispute between the two arose. Due to the king's inability to settle the matter, Divish was imprisoned in his own castle for 7 long years, while his young wife Stephanie attempted to raise his ransom to free him. Thanks to the help of friends, including Racek Kobyla, he was finally liberated and Medek was condemned for his action as a rebel. From 1400 onwards, Divish held the office of the Prague Burgrave, and from 1401 he moved his seat to Prague. Meanwhile, Talmberg Castle was repaired, and he gave it to his wife. Divish remained there in 1414, and in 1418 his son Oldrich governed the estate. According to some sources, Divish died in 1415, while others attest that in 1418 Jan Jankowski sold him Jankov Castle, where the Talmberg family lived until 1702. Divish had 3 sons, Oldrich, Wilhelm, and Mikulas, who governed Jankov from 1433 onwards. William of Talmberg and Milchin. In 1297, the head of the provincial court, the direct founder of the Talmberg branch, and the direct bearer of the Hrosnata coat of arms. The Hrosnata family was one of the few that did not directly engage in the war against the king, so they did not forfeit property. He founded Talmberg Castle. He had 2 sons, Divish and Nezamysl. The Zayans family of Zalush and Hasenberg. A family of Bohemian nobles whose main seat was Hasenberg Castle. Zajeczek, Little Hare, Oldrich of Waldeck, was the first to take the name in 1232. In 1335, Zbigniew Zając, Zając is a Czech word for hare, of Waldeck, and Zebrak purchased the Gothic castle near the village of Klapy, near Lipchonowice from King John of Luxembourg, and renamed it Hasenberg. The German word for hare is Hase. During the Hussite Wars, the lords were on the side of the Catholics allied to the Emperor Sigismund. In the 14th century, the family lost much of its property, and thereafter historical records became rather scarce. The Zayans family gradually dwindled until it died out altogether in the 17th century. The best known representatives of the family include William Zając of Wladek before 1289 to 9th of October 1319, who was a friend of the Przemyślid Elizabeth of Bohemia, mother of Charles IV, whom he helped raise when he was at Krivoklad Castle. He was one of the feudal lords from West Bohemia who accused Henry of Lipa of plotting against the king. Willem Zając of Wladek and Zilonowice, son of Zbigniew and Catherine of Litomyśl. During the wars in Moravia between the brothers Jobst and Prokop of Luxembourg, William initially served in the army of the elder brother, then after 1399 he fought on the side of Prokopus. Once the power struggle ended, he worked as a diplomat for Jobst. Thanks to his marriage to Dorota of Rabstein, the widow of Henry of Rabstein, he acquired in pawn the estate of Zydlichowice and its fortress, which the Margrave bequeathed to William in 1407. William Zając not only did spend time in Moravia, but also traveled widely, frequenting Prague, Olomouc, Lužice, and undertaking trips to France and Brandenburg, as well as going on pilgrimages to Rome and Santiago de Compostela. Jobst regarded his services most highly, and at the end of 1407 promoted him to the position of hetman of the Duchy of Luxembourg. After the death of the Margrave, William continued to serve Wenceslas IV from 1412 onwards, and from 1412 onwards Sigismund of Luxembourg, Zbigniew Zając of Hasenberg from 1376 to 1411. Zbigniew Zając of Hasenberg, the son of William of Hasenberg, was a Prague archbishop between 1403 and 1411, a member of the court of Wenceslas IV, the Provost of Melnik, and a military leader. Although he was a supporter of Jan Hus at the onset of the 15th century, from 1407 onwards he was in public opposition to him. On 16th of July 1410, he even burned Wilclav's writings and placed Jan Hus under an interdict. This met with protests not only from the citizens of Prague, but also from King Wenceslas IV himself, who demanded that the interdict be withdrawn. Zbigniew had demanded that Zbigniew rejected the demand and subsequently remained absent from the country for several years. His lack of education earned him the popular moniker Bishop Alphabet. Okay, that's quite a funny thing for, I assume, regular people mocking him for being poorly educated, where they themselves were most likely poorly educated as well. But obviously he was an archbishop of Prague, so I imagine quite a lot was expected from him. His body lies in St. Vitus's Cathedral in Prague. Wenceslas IV, from 1361 to 1419, Wenceslas IV of Luxembourg was the son of the highly successful monarch Charles IV. He inherited the Bohemian throne and attained the German crown by election. However, he did not inherit his father's predisposition for ruling. Already during his lifetime he was known as a weak, idle and moody ruler who was afflicted with many ailments, as well as difficulties meeting his royal obligations, despite the fact that he had been groomed for rule since early childhood. He was crowned Bohemian king at the age of only 2 years. He was more interested in hunting, alcohol, courtesans, and pleasures of the court. During his time as king, the lands of Bohemian crown underwent several wars and conflicts involving his relatives, his own brother Sigismund and his cousins, the Moravian Margraves. The event that triggered the Margravite Wars was that Wenceslas occupied the vacated estates of the Olomouc Archdiocese, which by law belonged to the nobles. Under the leadership of Jobst, the Moravian lords joined with Sigismund in open revolt against the king, which had less to do with the Olomouc estates and more with the legitimacy of the rule of Wenceslas, who in the meantime had been stripped of the imperial crown by the imperial electors for his incompetence and unwillingness to rule. Later he also lost the power of the Bohemian crown when he made numerous concessions and awarded the nobles many privileges, de facto transferring the ruling power to them. His unwillingness to meet the obligations resulted in his abdication, abduction twice, thereby removing him from the throne, first in 1394 by the Czech nobles and then in 1402 by his brother Sigismund. Wenceslas has initially supported the reform proposals of Jan Hus and his adherents, but did nothing to save the reformer's life when he was sentenced to be burned at the stake by the church. He thus set in motion what was later to become the largest and one of the most successful popular revolts in Europe, the Hussite Wars. However, he did not live to see the events, since he died in 1419. After his death, his brother Sigismund of Hungary seized the crown, but he had to fight for it, since not everyone acknowledged his claim, and once he had the crown, he did not live long to enjoy it. Okay, as I said, I'll go back to the new entries in general, as well as any entries that might unlock in those other categories, because there's still quite a few in characters that are still undiscovered. I will do that, a couple of episodes in the future. For now, that's all for this one. Normal gameplay will resume from the next one, so I will see you on the next one. Bye!